Okay, this session I'm working on MPDInfoScreen2, which is a client for MPD, Music Player Daemon. MPDInfoScreen2 displays stats of the currently playing song, and MPD is Music Player Daemon, which is something that runs in the background and plays your music for you. And because it runs in the background and has support for clients, there are a lot of different MPD clients you can use to control it, to manage your playlists and stuff like that. Before this session, MPDInfoScreen2 could only connect to MPD via a TCP address like 192.168.0.2 or whatever. But this session adds support for connecting to it via a unix-socket. Well, if you use Linux or macOS even, I think macOS has support for sockets as well, but basically a socket acts like a file on the file system, but you connect to it by specifying the path to it. And then the data you pass back and forth is similar to data you pass back and forth through TCP. So basically, if you have MPD running on a computer and you have a client running on the same computer, you could use a socket instead of TCP for faster, for a more, well, it's on the same computer, so you know what I mean by that. But not everything uses Unix sockets, but MPD, being a music player daemon mainly on Linux, has socket support. So I figured might as well add socket support to MPDInfoScreen2. This software is written in C++, so I'm using NeoVim this session. Right now, setting up the arg parsing for it. Since you can specify both TCP address or a Unix socket path, I made host and host socket, those two options, they're mutually exclusive, which means you could only use one or the other, but not both. Not both at the same time, I mean. Now that the arg parsing should be handling getting the socket path, it's time to implement giving the socket path to the client code, client part of the code, and having it connect via the socket when it's available. So I make use of a ternary expression so I don't have to put the if statements around the client initialization. Ternary is like if expression then part 1, otherwise part 2, but in a single line. The syntax in C and C++ is expression question mark part 1 colon part 2. Seems I need to update the unit tests because the API changed for client the client class, the MPD client class. So I need to store the path to the socket in the client class. And I need to not generate the IPv4 address immediately when the constructor is called, because it's not necessarily an address. Socket path could be passed in this session. By the end of this session, it changes. Placing a string declaration to store the socket path, which will be used when initiating the connection. Renaming TCP to connection because it's now more generic. Since it could now be a unix-socket or a TCP connection. So it renamed TCP socket to connection socket. And a few other things got to be renamed as well. sectioning off the code that's TCP specific. And the first part will be using a unix-socket, and the second part is the TCP stuff. And after that is generic file descriptor handling, which should be the same behavior with both an established TCP connection and an established unix-socket connection. This error is because of some incomplete text in the beginning of the file. Yeah, right here. So this stuff isn't really necessary to look up the protocol number because I could just use 0 for the default settings as specified on the man page for Unix connections, Unix socket connections, that is. So there's a file name length limit on the socket address. So I have to check that the path isn't too long. The +1 is because it's a C string. It needs to store the entire string and then a 0 byte after the string. That's what a C string is. You figure out how long a string is by finding the 0 at the end of the string. Rust has strings that are just the buffer and a size type. So the size value tells you how long it is. C strings is just a buffer, but there's a 0 at the end of the string. And the 0 at the end tells you how long it is. So a lot of unpleasantness with this kind of thing because the null byte at the end of the C string means you have to search the entire string for how long it is, which can be painful. For this is just one of the reasons why a lot of people do not like C strings. Since socket path is a std string, which is a C++ string, it has a function called c_str, which makes sure that the buffer returned by that function is ending with a null byte, because the C++ string is a buffer and a string length like Rust. But for backwards compatibility with C, it has a function for making the buffer a C string buffer. Since I have warnings becoming errors with the debug builds, not using the ret variable was showing up as an error when compiled. Now that all the changes have been made, it's time to test it because it should be functional. The new functionality should be working now. Just need to test it to make sure it didn't make a mistake. So there's a check if host wasn't called. And I need to update that call to also check for host socket call or host socket argument. Since it's a graphical application, it wasn't recorded by Asciinema. But long story short, I do get it working, but well, I'll talk about that when the time comes. Here I'm contemplating using a socket or socat with a socket so that I can forward from inside the development user to the Steven user. But since I'm developing in a development user, in other words, I'm developing as the dev user on this system, but my privileged user is the Steven user, the user that can use sudo and stuff like that. But I think, oh, whatever, I'll just do what I want to do without forwarding, which is to use valgrind, which has memcheck, which checks for memory leaks, and it took forever for it to run on MPDInfoScreen2 because it needs to, well, valgrind memcheck for some reason on Arch Linux is configured. It's set up to handle debug symbols, downloading from the network, so that it has the debugging symbols for the program it's testing. And these debugging symbols have information like what line is responsible for what part of a call stack when there's an error or some kind of tracking of memory leaks, for example. While I was waiting for valgrind to run, I decided to check the code again. Doing some minor refactoring, renaming a variable to something that makes sense. Thinking about running MPD as development user to debug this. Ignore the password. That's very temporary. So I'm stopping the valgrind call and testing local running MPD in the development user as a development user. Since I'm running as the Steven user and in the terminal logged in as the development user, Pipewire running as the development user is using a dummy sync. So any audio that currently plays as the development user doesn't actually play anywhere, which doesn't really matter for me because I just need to test that the client, that MPDInfoScreen2 works. I don't need to check the audio output. I just need to check that it displays the song information correctly. This is where I'm forwarding X11 to my X Wayland as at running as the Steven user. I tried running valgrind in the X terminal, but that also takes a while, so I think I gave up on that. So running valgrind as development user, connected to the forwarded display using the parameters to quickly get to displaying stuff. But valgrind being what it is takes a while. I mean, the first run on an updated system, valgrind will always take a while because the debugging symbols have changed, because the dependencies have changed. Like the standard library stuff, I don't know, just a huge pain in the neck to deal with valgrind sometimes. And it was even painful in this particular instance because when I tested further after the session, it said that there were memory leaks with MPDInfoScreen2. But after some stress testing, there wasn't actually a memory leak with this program. It's just something with the session I don't really understand fully. Maybe it's because I'm using, what's it called again? Plasma. What was it called again? I was using Plasma Login Manager to log in this way as Steven user. And I think that might have caused problems for memory leak. Basically, I stress tested it, and the amount of memory that was supposedly leaked was the same as running it for like 1 second. So there isn't a memory leak. It's just something to do with GTK or font config. It's very strange. I don't know. It's a headache, but as far as I can tell, my code doesn't have a problem. I do have proper memory management going on and a generic cleanup function handler going on as well. Anyways, I noticed there's a weird bug with this program. If you look closely, you can see that some of the output logs, when I use a socket, with some songs, it fails to load the album art. And it's a very strange bug. It points to heap corruption at some point, I think. If you have something that suddenly doesn't work in one part of your C or C++ code, and it's always like a random place or something, that's a sign of memory corruption in the heap, which means there's a buffer overflow going on somewhere. So I'll probably be doing some debugging on this program later on, just to see if there is a buffer overflow, because everything about that album art loading failing points to a buffer overflow at some point. But I don't know where. Not right now. Anyways, most of the time it works properly, but if you use a socket, it kind of fails to load the album art every once in a while. Which is a pain in the neck, but it is what it is. Anyways, you can stop watching the video now because the rest of this recording is trying to debug this, unsuccessfully finding the bug. So there may be a bug here, or it's just something weird behavior with MPD connecting via a socket that's causing the problem. Because I remember if I try to use a MPD client on my phone, on Android, it would fail to load album art sometimes. That indicates to me that it's not specific to my program, MPDInfoScreen2. It might be because it's connecting to MPD, but then again, my Android client is connecting with TCP, so that might not be it either. Because if I use TCP with MPDInfoScreen2, it works fine. Yeah, it's a headache to think about. I'm not sure what's going on. I don't know why it works properly sometimes and why it doesn't. I tried to add some debug prints to figure it out, but yeah. Long story short, the rest of the session I don't figure it out, and it sometimes goes away for most of the time. So you can stop watching this video now. There's nothing more else to see. Just print lines and trying to debug the failing to load album art, and eventually pushing the changes and making a new version. So that's basically it. Thanks for watching, and you don't have to watch the rest of this, like I said.